Pedro da Silva était un homme de foi qui croyait en Dieu et qui le voyait comme une source de force et de courage, pareil à ceux qui sont venus s'établir en Nouvelle-France dans les années 1600.
On the second day of August of the year 1717 in the city of Quebec, Pedro da Silva died, most likely a victim of yellow fever. Pedro was buried immediately in the absence of his family and friends. Everyone was too afraid of contracting the disease that had killed him. Some 71 years earlier, Pedro had been born in a place facing many challenges. The year was 1647. New France documents indicate that Pedro da Silva, the son of José da Silva and Ana Maria Francisca, was baptized at St. Julian's Catholic Parish Church in the capital of Portugal, Lisbon. In a time of tremendous political and social instability, Pedro would survive hunger, war, and disease to grow up a healthy and strong-willed young man.
O Pedro da Silva teve a sorte de não ser recrutado para a guerra, para as guerras da restauração, porque toda a gente era recrutada, inclusive os estudantes da universidade eram recrutados para a defesa das fronteiras. Teve a sorte de não ser afetado por nenhuma das doenças, devia ser um rapaz rijo, com saúde.
Je connaissais Pedro da Silva depuis plusieurs années. Un personnage remarquable, travaillant, courageux et surtout, un homme à qui on pouvait faire confiance. Il était unique et irremplaçable.
Such words would have been said about a man who, in spite of all odds, had already crossed an ocean, only to face the harshness of a foreboding climate and a society foreign in culture and in language. And yet, Pedro da Silva would embrace such a world as his own and thrive in it to become a famous and respected citizen. Some of Pedro da Silva's early experiences would have prepared him for life in such a place as Canada's New France. In his youth, he had interacted with French soldiers who were constantly arriving in Lisbon to help the Portuguese in its war of independence against the Spanish.
É muito provável que os contactos estabelecidos por Pedro da Silva com os franceses nesta conjuntura, neste período intenso entre 1660 e 1666, tenham permitido que ele começasse a dominar o francês, o que facilitou muito a sua ida para a França e depois para o Quebec.
Quelle tristesse de ne pouvoir être à ses côtés durant ces derniers moments. Impossible de lui tenir les mains. Lui dire comment je l'aimais. Pedro, mon mari, quand un de nos enfants rendait l'âme, tu as su quoi faire afin que nous ne tombions pas dans le désespoir. Maintenant que tu les as rejoints, qui va me consoler, moi?
Pedro was buried with no special funeral ceremonies. No eulogies. Only the canon of the cathedral and two seminary students representing important families of Quebec City attended his burial in the cemetery of Notre-Dame de Quebec. When Portugal finally regained its independence from Spain, Pedro da Silva would have started thinking about his own freedom. In 1665, the year of the last battle against the enemy, he was only a young man of 18. But within a mere 7 years, he too, like his native country, would gain his independence and find a new homeland. When Pedro arrived on the shores of the St. Lawrence River, the hustle and bustle of his native Lisbon would have been a distant memory in the face of unknown challenges in an unknown world. In his luggage, Pedro carried the determination of youth and the strength of character to face whatever came his way, and to succeed in life as he did, beyond anyone's imagination. A vibrant city of over 500,000 people, the capital of the province of Quebec, Quebec City, is today a busy port and trading hub, known for its cultural joie de vivre. Named a World Heritage heritage city in 1985, it's one of the only walled cities in Canada. And inside the old town walls, along cobbled laneways lined with cozy Gallic stone cottages, are several reminders of its origins. The history of New France's Canada and its capital are closely related to the name Samuel de Champlain, a French explorer who in 1608 opened a trading post in the area that would become known as Quebec City. Life in the new colony was a lot simpler than in Europe. Even though social distinctions in New France matched the ones in the old continent, the boundaries between them were less rigid.
En Nouvelle-France, les différents groupes sociaux, les classes sociales sont beaucoup plus près les uns des autres. Donc, c'est un peu le modèle français, mais d'une manière beaucoup plus simplifiée. Donc, on le voit par les alliances matrimoniales. Donc, les gens vont se marier entre eux et un bourgeois va épouser la fille d'un noble et faire un beau mariage et finalement terminer sa vie avec une relative aisance.
When Le Portugais, as Pedro was soon called, arrived, the town of Quebec had already evolved from a fortified trading post to a sizable village of about 1,100 inhabitants. The economy was steadily growing. While it's agreed among most historians that Pedro de Silva arrived in New France sometime between 1672 and 1673, it is a matter of speculation where he arrived from. One theory is that he sailed from France, as 5 other Portuguese had done earlier.
Uma possibilidade que se pode colocar como hipótese da ida de Pedro da Silva para o Canadá poderia ter sido a partir do Porto de La Rochelle, portanto, na medida em que havia relações muito intensas entre Lisboa e o Porto de La Rochelle, e talvez, quem sabe, se Pedro da Silva não teria participado em alguma das embaixadas portuguesas ou francesas que constantemente se relacionaram entre si.
Não sabemos.
On this side of the Atlantic, others have proposed different theories.
Ele atravessou o Atlântico, é seguro, mas era náufrago. Seria um judeu convertido? Não, seguramente. Náufrago, provavelmente. Terá sido convencido pelos 5 portugueses que já existiam à volta da cidade de Quebec para ficar. Não sabemos.
At the time, it was said that he who crossed the Atlantic considered himself out of danger when standing on the shores of Quebec. Pedro's luck in this regard would soon be followed by more good fortune. It would seem he had arrived in New France at the best of times.
1672, c'est l'époque, c'est une époque de paix. C'est l'époque aussi où la France s'est beaucoup investie dans sa colonie. Donc, en l'espace de quelques années, entre 1663 et 1672, la population double en Nouvelle-France. Et la paix étant faite avec les Iroquois, un état de paix aussi avec les autres colonies anglaises ou hollandaises. Donc, on assiste à une croissance assez rapide au niveau de la colonie. Donc, on arrive à un bon moment.
In December of 1673, Pedro signed a 6-month work contract, his first, with one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in New France, Bertrand Chenet de la Garenne. He likely worked as an escort in his boss's sailing ship, which carried goods to and from Quebec and the towns around it. At the end of his 6-month work contract, Pedro seemed to have made a good impression on his boss, who eventually became his friend and protector too. This good fortune, and the acquaintance of a certain young lady, would have been reason enough for Pedro to stay permanently in Canada. In those days, there was enormous pressure on single men living in New France to get married.
From 1663 to 1673, there was approximately 1 woman for every 15 men. But after 10 years, there was some sort of an equilibrium, and then the administrators decided it would be time for the young men to get married. So they were deprived of their right to go for fur trading, which was an important revenue for them. Under this kind of social pressure, it is very likely that a man like Pedro de Silva would have to get married very quickly.
On the 16th day of May, 1677, Pedro de Silva put his signature on a marriage certificate next to Jean Grelon's, his new 15-year-old wife, thus becoming bound to family and country for better or for worse. For all the good that was to happen in his life, Pedro's lot was set for a rocky start during his first year as a married man. Following their marriage, Pedro and Jean settled at Beauport near Quebec City, according to the 1681 census. Their first year of marriage was rocked by a series of scandals due, in great part, to the political and economic realities of the day. The highest political figures in the new colony were the governor and the intendant. Both worked side by side, but not always harmoniously. There were often conflicts between the two. Such was the case between Governor Louis de Buade, Count of Frontenac, and his intendant. Their ongoing feud over fur trading would ultimately involve Pedro.
Dans une lettre que Frontenac adresse aux autorités, il se plaint des agissements de l'intendant du Chéneau. Et entre autres, il dénonce des individus, entre autres un Portugais établi à Beauport, qui serait de connivence avec l'intendant. Ce Portugais serait probablement Pedro da Silva dit Portugais. Il y avait d'autres Portugais dans les environs, mais c'est lui qui colle le plus à cette description.
Another sad event for Pedro da Silva was a scandal involving his young wife, just 1 year after their marriage.
At the time, downtown Quebec was a party zone when the ships came from France. Okay? And on the farms around Quebec, it was a very boring life. And there was a neighbor of the mother of Jean Grelon, Pedro's wife, that she invited very probably both mother and daughter to go to have fun on downtown. They danced, they drink very probably, they have fun, but for the moral of for the standards of those times, it was not an acceptable behavior for married women.
As a result of the incident, all 3 women were expelled from the city for a period of time and threatened with corporal punishment if they didn't abide by the law. In spite of these early difficulties, it is believed that Pedro and his wife led a fairly normal married life, especially after the family settled in Quebec City's lower town in 1682, where they remained for the rest of their lives. The safety and comfort the Silvas found in their new home at Soto Matelot Street was in great part due to Pedro's sense of duty and devotion to his family.
Pedro da Silva was a family man. He always kept all his family, all his sons and wife, all in the city of Quebec or on the surroundings of the city of Quebec, which was the most secure town in New France. We cannot forget that there was a war in those times. There's a war against the Indians, Iroquois, and against the New Englanders.
While the first year of marriage had been marred by scandals, subsequent years were hardly free from tragedy. The 25th of January, 1689, Pedro and Jean lost their first daughter, born 43 days earlier, during a devastating epidemic of measles. Later on, as many as 5 of their children died during the 1702-1703 epidemics. And then a 25-year-old son was lost in 1715. These epidemics were devastating, not only for the Silva family, but also for the general population.
C'est une épidémie de petite vérole, de variole, aujourd'hui on dirait. Évidemment, les anciens textes disent que c'est une épidémie qui est apportée par les Amérindiens de passage pour probablement vendre leur fourrure. C'est un choc, évidemment, important parce qu'il y a eu beaucoup de morts.
For now, in the year 1689, everything was overshadowed by the fear of war. In 1689, the same year that Pedro and his wife lost their first child, France and its Huron allies, and England with the support of the Iroquois, had engaged in a military confrontation. The so-called Lachine Massacre was one of the most gruesome events in this terrible war.
When the Native Americans would find themselves in a situation in a battle, typically the end result would often be a massacre. That was sort of part of the culture of battle at the time.
In this culture of battle, civilians would be caught by surprise and killed. The massacre at Lachine was no exception. Men, women, and children. No one was spared. Fortunately, the Iroquois attacks didn't reach the town of Quebec City, where Pedro de Silva and his family lived. However, danger was never very far. In October of 1690, a New England war fleet besieged the town of Quebec. These were moments of high anxiety and even panic. Luckily, the American fleet eventually retreated after a humiliating defeat. It is known that Pedro de Silva kept on delivering messages, perhaps for the troops as well as for his regular customers, during this dangerous Iroquois conflict. He showed enormous courage, facing the constant threat of being ambushed and killed. Ultimately, this courage would lead to bigger things, would open the pathway to the great adventure of his life. The St. Lawrence. This mighty river carries the waters of 5 Great Lakes in a long voyage of more than 3,000 kilometers to the Atlantic Ocean. This is the river where Pedro de Silva lived his passions of water and freedom. And yes, it was the pathway for his chosen profession as a messenger of mail and transporter of goods. One of the big challenges of navigating the St. Lawrence was the river itself.
The dangers of the St. Lawrence in the 17th century come from the varied topography of the river. There are the confusing currents among the Boucherville and the Sorel Islands. There's the shallow water of Lake St. Peter, which is highly susceptible to the wind. In front of Deschambault, there are some rapids, which don't exist anymore today. And of course, between Three Rivers and Quebec City, you got the effect of the tide, which affects the current itself of the river. And of course, there are many reefs which are not known because the hydrography of the river, of course, is not well developed at that particular time.
Pedro knew of the challenges he would be facing in the river. Mean currents and strong winds, treacherous rocks and sandbars, hundreds of channels, some of them with no exit, no lighthouses along the way to guide him, and native attacks, especially in wartime. On moonless nights, the darkness on the river was terrifying, alleviated only by the dim lights from the farms on the North Shore, where sometimes Pedro and his companions might have spent the odd night. Most often, however, it was safer to stay in the boat, where they cooked their own meals and slept under a canvas. Rivers in Canada were closed in the beginning of the winter, opening again at the end of the melting season in spring. In winter, river traveling was done in carrioles and wagons, often pulled by dogs or even oxen. It is believed that Pedro's growing reputation for safely transporting goods, packages, and letters was due in part to the fact that he continued to do so even during the harsh winter months. He was most probably the first messenger to accomplish this in Canada's New France. Pedro de Silva was already moving mail and goods between Quebec City and Montreal as early as 1693. In July of that year, he was paid 20 sols to take a package of letters from Montreal to Quebec City. This would have been the beginning of an illustrious career as a trusted messenger. Traveling along the river in his flat-bottom boat, carrying and sometimes escorting merchandise, distributing important messages, Pedro's reputation grew stronger. People admired his trustworthiness and, above all, his extraordinary courage, particularly in the face of the risks he took during the war with the Iroquois.
The threat was really twofold. First of all, the threat was being outright ambushed and massacred on the spot. That was one option. The second one was being captured, which was even worse. And capture meant from there either being tortured, in various ways and something dragging out for a long period of time. The threat of being killed was real.
Throughout the long war, Pedro da Silva faced all of these dangers. Like anybody else, he would have had terrible nightmares when traveling along the river. But being who he was, he continued with his work in spite of the risks to his own life. It would appear that Pedro was also a very discreet man. There is not one single recorded incident that would cast doubt on Pedro's character as a messenger of the king.
Pedro was a tough man, courageous and very trustable man. He was delivering all the official correspondence of the colony between governments, and nobody would trust a drunk man with such important documents. Alcohol was very well consumed in New France, in all its forms, beer, wine, brandy, but not in the case of Pedro da Silva, that he was for sure a sober man.
Courageous, trustworthy, and dedicated, Pedro had finally arrived. Soon, he would receive news confirming his pioneering role in the field of communications and nation building. At the beginning of the new century, the 18th, the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, presided over the largest empire in the world. In his most prized colony, New France's Canada, Pedro da Silva had reached an equally unprecedented degree of fame and influence. Over the years, Pedro had rendered invaluable services to the influential families of the colony, distributing their official documents, messages, and merchandise when no one else would do it, especially during the very dangerous times of the Iroquois War. Thus, it would seem that the name Pedro da Silva had become quite famous. The year of 1705 would bring a new dimension to his social status.
Étant nécessaire pour le service du roi et le bien public d'établir en cette colonie un messager pour porter les ordres en tous les lieux de ce paix en haut besoin, sera étant informé de la diligence et fidélité de Pierre de Silva, dit le Portugais.
On the 23rd day of December in the year 1705, Pedro da Silva appeared before Jacques Rodeau, intendant of New France. He was to receive a very special commission from the king.
À mon commis établi le Portugais, messager ordinaire pour porter les lettres.
For his diligence and loyalty, Pedro da Silva was named Royal Messenger, responsible for the delivery of the royal mail throughout the entire colony, whether carried out by himself or any other in his name. Furthermore, for the first time, he was officially allowed to transport private mail and charge an established fee for this work.
Félicitations, Monsieur de Silva.
On this auspicious day, Pedro da Silva, Le Portugais, stepped into history, becoming Canada's first official postman. More than 2 centuries after his appointment as the first official mail carrier, Pedro's name received public recognition for the first time in Canada. In the spring of 1938, a group of Canada Post officials and politicians gathered in front of the post office building on Old Montreal's Rue Saint-Jacques to unveil a wall plaque that reads in part, "From 1693, couriers, the first known of whom was Pierre da Silva, called the Portuguese, carried the mail between Quebec and Montreal." This was Canada Post's way of honoring the man who had pioneered the field that led to the creation of one of the most respected and trusted public institutions in Canada.
Canada Post have undergone so many evolutions since the days of Pedro da Silva. We have gone from carrying the mail by hand and by boat and across lakes and rivers to and horse and carriage to transporting parcels through rail, plane, automobiles and trucks and whatnot. And what we've seen over our lengthy history is those same values that Pedro da Silva brought to our work, the tenacity, the courage, the patience, the determination, and these are all values that still resides within Canada Post culture today.
Canada's mail service has in fact undergone numerous and dramatic changes over the centuries. If he were alive today, would Pedro ever recognize mail delivery in the 21st century?
No, I don't think he would recognize the system that is currently in place, nor the dimensions from Atlantic to Pacific of our country in which the postal system operates. On the other hand, I think he would readily understand the preoccupation people have for the safe and secure and timely transmission of written messages. That is something he was doing in his day. That is something that the postal system does today.
Canada Post's 1938 recognition of Pedro's role, while significant, didn't have a national reach. It would take more than half a century after that year for Canada's first postman's name to be mentioned for the first time across the entire country.
Viva Pedro!
In the city of Toronto's West End, final touches are underway on a very special presentation, a float honoring Pedro da Silva, which will be part of the annual Portugal Day parade, celebrating on this day its 25th anniversary.
Pedro da Silva resonates everything that we're all about and what we stand for. So I think it's been a great victory for the Acapo and the Portuguese community in general to have this float in such a memorable parade like the 25th anniversary is.
Also among the friends of Pedro gathered here are members of a prominent group of individuals responsible for a unique idea, a postal stamp honoring Canada's first postman.
In December of 1986, Virgilio Pires visited Vancouver, I believe, to the World Fair. And while there, he came across some newspaper saying that Pedro da Silva had been the first middleman in Canada and that he was a Portuguese Canadian.
The idea of this stamp came about when Toronto industrialist Virgilio Pires returned home from a visit to Vancouver's World Fair. He shared the information with friends, all of whom belonged to a federation of business and professionals. That was the beginning of a dream, to have a postal stamp honoring Canada's first postman. A committee was formed.
Well, it was indeed a very hard process. Hard and long process, just because we had a lot of convincing to do. We found people that in reality were favorable, but at the same time, we had to face some of those that believed by approving the stamp of Pedro da Silva would be like, in their minds, creating a precedent.
The group kept the faith, writing letters to politicians, trying to convince decision makers that naming Pedro da Silva on a stamp was a simple matter of recognizing a Canadian historical reality.
Things started to move when there was some political intervention, and then things began to crystallize, and we know very well what the end result was.
In 2002, after some 15 years of persistent on and off lobbying, the group made a breakthrough at a meeting between Armindo Silva from the Stamp Committee and Andre Ouellette, then CEO of Canada Post.
When he asked me, well, can I do for you? I said, Mr. Ouellette, we have a saying in Portuguese that we tried twice, we failed, we cannot miss the third time, and this is the third time. And then I said, this is your history. This is the history of Canada Post. We're not making it up. You have it written down. So we want a stamp.
At the very moment, we felt very proud of our Portuguese heritage.
It was a very exciting moment. The recognition of a Portuguese person that contributed to nation building. To have that kind of recognition is something we had hitherto not achieved.
I felt good for the younger generations because they would have a motive for pride of their heritage in Canada.
I was particularly happy to do the stamp unveiling for Pedro da Silva at the CNE because of the Portuguese community in Toronto, how strong they have been in champions of a great Canada. And also it was very unique to hear about Pedro da Silva being Canada's first mailman.
The Pedro da Silva stamp was in circulation for only 2 years. The memory of it rests now at the Pioneers Gallery in Toronto, a space dedicated to honoring men and women who have contributed in a unique and special way to the progress of their community and of their country, and whose mandate is, in part, to inspire the young generations.
This museum is not only for the Portuguese people, it's for everybody. And Pedro da Silva is our best ambassador, is our flag to the kids.
Any kids.
Any kids.
I think that the contributions that Pedro da Silva made to this country are so inspirational. His determination, his worth as well, and that talks a little bit about to the Portuguese here in Canada and their perseverance coming to this country unknown and just being proud of who we are. And that's the message I want my children to be left with.
The passing of Canadian history to the younger generations must naturally include the significant pioneering role of immigrants, all immigrants. Pedro da Silva figuring in the pantheon of early nation builders.
This country is formed by many other nationalities, and not only French and English. And of course, over the years, we were taught that the English and the French did everything. Well, it's not so.
I think Pedro da Silva specifically had a huge role because of the services that he performed, which weren't done before. So he was very much a hero and an adventurer that took chances, very much like Portuguese navigators did.
It took almost 3 centuries for the first truly public recognition to emerge, only to be almost forgotten. Begs the question, has Pedro's pioneering role in the building of this country been properly recognized?
Canada is a huge country at that time, and communication, so transmitting information from a place to another place, it's important for the life, for military point of view, for economic point of view. So to have someone that the state has a good confidence in his value, it's important. So I think Pedro da Silva is a kind of model for us, someone who starts from almost nothing, and at the end of his life, he enjoyed a good reconnaissance from his neighbors and from the states. For this reason, I think he should be better recognized.
Similar to the stamp idea, but going a step further, the notion of a more permanent and enduring national acknowledgement of Pedro da Silva's role seems to be gaining strength among some of his many admirers, namely a statue honoring Canada's first postman.
A estátua devia de aparecer e devia de ser unido, todos os portugueses estamos no Canadá, tanto os franceses como os canadianos estamos aqui da parte inglesa, devemos juntar porque é um português. Então, devemos fazer uma petição, todos, e exigir ao próprio governo que nós temos o direito daquele homem ter uma estátua porque faz parte da história do Canadá.
Pedro da Silva could have been celebrated today in any other city or region of the country, for he is an inspiration to all Canadians who are proud of their heritage. Da Silva and others like him should in fact be honored every day for their pioneering contribution to their country, Canada. After receiving the title of Messager du Roi, Pedro continued to deliver mail, even though it probably was not his most profitable activity.
Bonjour monsieur, ici le courrier du roi.
He seems to have been a shrewd businessman. In his later years, his activities in mail delivery may have been a way to make inroads with rich and influential customers and obtain lucrative contracts in other fields, such as the transportation of furs.
Pedro could not have just delivered mail because it's not enough to make a life. I think it was his way of to establish some contacts, to know people and to be known by the people, and to build up a good reputation. And this led to very profitable contracts, such as delivering furs or other kind of merchandise.
It is not known what Pedro did in the final stages of his life, but one can suppose that he kept on going with his merchandise deliveries. He may have entrusted mail delivery itself to his son-in-law, Jean Morin. It was this same Jean Morin who would become the second New France Messager du Roi. Pedro de Silva died suddenly on August 2nd, 1717, most likely of yellow fever, at his home in Quebec City. He was about 71 years of age. A few months after Pedro de Silva's death, on the 22nd day of January 1718, Pedro's widow visited the royal notary, Florent de la Setière, for an inventory of her husband's possessions.
Nous avions quelques terres de plusieurs arpents, la maison.
What was amazing and surprised me, it was the quantity of dishes he got in there. Over 30 dishes and lots of tools for the kitchen. It seems that Pedro da Silva, it was a man that until his last day, he received lots of people around. He didn't have a cow and 2 pigs in his courtyard. No debts. He was, though, a man that, he was just one bill in there, but he didn't have time to pay. And that was, I think, because he died suddenly. Though it was not a rich man, but it was a very comfortable man. It was, he provided to his family a very comfortable way of life. That's for sure.
Pedro's possessions were estimated to be worth some £819. The real inventory, however, was far more valuable when one factors in the example of a life of dedication, an example of which all Canadians are the inheritors. Some of the inheritors of Pedro de Silva's legacy are the many direct descendants living in Canada. Today, a few are gathered at this park in Laval, Quebec, to celebrate their heritage. They chose this park, built a few years ago, thanks to the efforts of the Mission of Our Lady of Fatima at Laval, with the support of the city, the Board of Education, and the many volunteers.
This was a park that was built by hundreds of volunteers from our community, which they put everything you're seeing here today, they put up with their own hands. That you go from the pavé on the floor, the gazebo, the park itself, was all done by our volunteers.
The mission named the park after Pedro de Silva, a source of pride for the community.
Personally, I am very proud that the descendants of Pedro de Silva chose this location to celebrate the name of Pedro de Silva, and it brings us a certain honor. The festivities are great. We have the band of the Holy Ghost with us, which make them more Portuguese.
The pride in Pedro's legacy unites the generations gathered here today, old and young.
Je suis reconnaissant de ce que Pedro da Silva a fait pour nous à la préparation de sa continuité, parce qu'il a été le premier qui a fait le courrier pour le roi de Montréal à Québec. Je suis très fier de notre famille d'être portugais, de descendance portugaise.
To my family, to my father, to my grandfather, it was always something precious to be descendant from Pedro da Silva. We have great pride from it, and it was just normal for me to be here with my daughter this morning.
Interest in Pedro's Portuguese roots led another descendant, Suzanne de Silva, to travel to Lisbon and conduct research that appears to challenge some of the information in documents from New France.
J'aurais trouvé dans cette recherche-là que Pedro de Silva serait né le 10 juin 1647 à Setúbal, c'est-à-dire 50 km au sud de Lisbonne. Ses parents, Joseph et Marie, se seraient mariés le 7 janvier 1645 à Setúbal aussi. Alors, est-ce véridique ou pas? L'avenir nous le dira avec le grand généalogiste qui est en train de déchiffrer le document.
Historical records dating from centuries ago can often lead to contradictions. There are simply too many unknowns and variables. In spite of discrepancies between New France and Lisbon records, Suzanne is reasonably convinced Pedro was born in Setúbal, not Lisbon, admitting that he probably came to the capital with his parents at a very early age. Suzanne is not alone in her quest to know more about Pedro's roots and his legacy. Francine de Silva, the organizer of this family gathering, is herself embarking on an ambitious project to research the family tree. This work, which may take up to 10 years, is motivated by her undeniable pride in her roots.
I feel in my heart that I would love to know all of the descendants of Pedro. I'd like to know their story, either man or woman, who they married, how many children they had, who survived. I want to know it all. I'm doing this because I am proud to be Portuguese. I have to say, it's been so many years, but it fulfills me to know that I am coming from a Portuguese descendant.
S'il vous plaît, on fait un toast à Pedro da Silva. À Pedro da Silva. À Pedro da Silva.
After the brief funeral, Pedro's body was buried on the grounds of Notre Dame Cathedral in Quebec City, the same church where he had married.
After the funeral, it happened that people were buried under the church. At the time of the reconstruction of the church, all the bones that were found in the basement, everywhere, were put in ossuaries. And this is probably where are the bones of Pedro da Silva today.
Je m'étais promis, lorsque j'aurais découvert mes racines, que je reviendrais dans des lieux communs, et ici c'est l'endroit idéal.
I'm here to say to my ancestor, thank you, Pedro, for giving me an identity. You are my hero.
Suzanne Masson and Alvin de Silva had never met before today, but they have a lot in common.
Il y a environ 20 ans que j'ai découvert que Pedro da Silva était mon ancêtre par le biais de ma grand-mère paternelle. Et c'est vraiment fantastique de vivre ici et de découvrir que mon ancêtre a pu y passer aussi. C'est émouvant.
For a long time, I've been wondering what my background was, what my roots were. So some people were telling me that we were Spanish by the name. But my sister Delia did some research in Europe while she lived there, and she found out that we were Portuguese. So I did my own research in Canada, and I found out that I was a direct descendant of Pedro da Silva. I'm very thankful for that. For me, it's a great honor.
Today, Alvin is also joined by his son Ron, who expressed an interest in visiting the cathedral as a way of reaffirming his identity and that of his own children.
It was important for me to be here. I guess not only for myself, but for my brothers and sisters and our children. My dad did a lot of research, and we were very happy when we were informed that we were direct descendants from Pedro da Silva. To come here and to see it for yourself means a lot, and it's quite a good feeling to know where you're coming from.
At the time of his funeral, Pedro's immediate family were not able to say their goodbyes. So we're here for them also, and for our entire family, and for the hundreds of his other descendants that couldn't make this journey.
Ce n'est jamais trop tard pour se souvenir et honorer les morts.
Suzanne, Alvin, and Ron are also here for an entire community of Canadians who are proud of their heritage and wish to honor one of their illustrious pioneers, Pedro da Silva, Canada's first postman.